Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 36 of Series 7. The question for today is, why should we value the intrinsic value of other people? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 8. Now, we have recently been talking about various aspects of value as a principle of life. These have included ethics, meaning, truth, death, criteria of value, the will to power, and the will to value. Today, I want to talk about other people as another primary focus of value in our lives. But this way of understanding the significance of other people has been neglected. The question of relations with other people is often monopolized by ethics, and ethics is also sometimes mistakenly thought to be exclusively about other people. These are narrow views of both ethics and other people that I want to dispel. There are, however, valid ethical questions about other people that need to be answered. Yet there are many other ways in which other people figure in our lives. That is, other people are primarily instances of intrinsically valuable, reflectively conscious beings, and as such they have huge significance that is obscured by their familiarity. For example, other people figure as intrinsic values within systems of meaning. In groups, other people constitute social frameworks which enhance and objectify beliefs and ideas. Other people have also been cited as factors in the development of our own self-consciousness. That is, we might need a concept of or awareness of others in order to develop self-awareness. Related to this, we have discussed various criteria of right or correct values that I will mention again later. I also want to note the issue of the appreciation of others as another criterion of value. But before tackling these issues, we need to ask about the nature of the connections between people. And there is no doubt that these connections have been greatly misunderstood in many ways. There are a couple of ways in which it is mistakenly thought that we relate or connect to other people. One, spiritually or cosmologically through direct causal relations between people. And two, by means of an obscure ethical connection that might be seen as an aspect of spirituality. Another is phenomenological relations between people, often described as intersubjectivity. This involves our cognitive apprehension and the quality of our perception of other people. This is the kind of relation that I favour in this account. Yet let's look first at the idea of relations between people as spiritual or cosmological causal connections. This is the idea that we are connected by and are part of a universal consciousness, and that there is a hidden force connecting people, like gravity connects physical objects, or that there is a medium, like an ether, which connects all living and non-living objects. This view is held by Hindus and mystics, as well as by some modern thinkers, such as in Bishop Butler's monism and by Schopenhauer, Feuerbach and Rupert Sheldrake. But this is basically a religious belief without evidence that also has considerable arguments against it. For example, it is subject to criticisms of Malinowski and others of religion as a magic hidden causes or ethers. And such connecting ethers in spirituality and science are lacking in evidence. Some may want to find connections through quantum entanglement between minds, but such is contentious. Yet more significantly, such connections can only ever figure as extra forms of communication, and as such, spiritual or quantum connections are subject to questions of significance and choice. Moreover, philosophers like Bernard Williams, John Rawls, and John Findlay argue that individual separateness is indispensable to our understanding of what we think human beings are. I agree, we cannot employ an unexplained, mystical or magical way of thinking as a way of connecting people, and we apprehend other people through cognition, not through magical ethers. Yet I have spent some time in this question because it is often thought that even in ethics there is an almost magical connection between people. That is, there's more to our relation with others than our perception and our evaluative responses. So we can first discuss this issue in relation to ethics and different theories of ethics. The idea of ethical relations with other people suffer from several presuppositions. One understandable presupposition is that ethical relations with others depends on their intrinsic value. Another presupposition is that as people do have intrinsic value, we have to value them. And thirdly, is it the case that people really do have intrinsic value? The question of whether people really do have intrinsic value isn't one that we can tackle in depth today. Two problems are, can people who devalue their lives and want to end them really have intrinsic value? And secondly, how can we determine if anything has intrinsic value, including people? In my view, intrinsic value must be assigned reflexively by a state or a person. Contentiously, ethicists like Frankenna, Parfit and Dworkin assign intrinsic value to certain physical objects. Less contentiously, these and other thinkers assign intrinsic value to objects like truth, knowledge and justice. But John Mackey argues that there are no objective or intrinsic values in the physical external world. I agree, and I only accept mental states and people as candidates of intrinsic value. But despite these difficulties, there is a wide consensus that people do have intrinsic value. So for the purposes of this discussion, we can presuppose that they do have intrinsic value. The next question is whether ethical relation with others depends on their intrinsic value. Most theories accept that it does, but some theories do not. The ethical egoism of Max Stirner or Ayn Rand tends to discount other people on grounds that ethics is a question of self-interest. But both Stirner's and Rand's egoism face severe difficulties, like the limited conception of self-interest. That is, it doesn't appreciate how valuing other people reflects back onto one's own value. Solipsism is a denial of other people's existence that is even easier to discount. Yet Aristotle's virtue theory of dispositions, like excellence of character, is a more credible example of omission. That is, value-based virtues like goodwill and intrinsic value of others aren't prominent in virtue theory. But virtue theory has been widely criticized for just this deficit. Utilitarianism is another theory which eschews intrinsic values in general. in favour of pragmatic outcomes. Mill's exception is that only pleasure is uniquely valuable because it's the only thing we desire for its own sake. But many others, as well as myself, have argued that pleasure and happiness are inadequate objectives, as well as not being of intrinsic value. Another problem of utilitarianism is that of motivation. That is, why must we act for the common good of other people? Acting for the common good seems to require motivation beyond that of pleasure. Mill's informal response is that making other people happy produces our own happiness. But this is a contingent outcome of our happiness, and it isn't adequate as an ethical relation. Yet Peter Singer is a utilitarian with wider concerns than the standard pleasure and happiness. He addresses the question of other people as an aspect of ethics that a meaningful life requires. He argues that meaning requires concern for others as a wider purpose in life than ourselves. But this isn't an explicit or definitive reason for respecting the value of others. And as above, this is only a contingent reason for respecting the value of others. For example, science can also provide a wider purpose in life than ourselves. But Immanuel Kant is distinctive in recognizing the intrinsic value of other people in his categorical imperative. As one of the three major principles of his imperative, he writes that act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. In other words, other people are ends in themselves, not means to an end. The idea of people as ends in themselves with intrinsic value is intuitively compelling, but we must ask, why are people as ends in themselves with intrinsic value, and why should we value them? Yet when we examine Kant's position closely, we find that it has serious problems. Firstly, he assigns intrinsic value to people, not because of sentience or consciousness, but because of their rationality. Secondly, we must ask, why does he assign value for these and indeed other reasons? Kant's esteem of rationality is a factor here. Yet for Kant, rationality is also a means of attaining dignity. And Kant's assignment of dignity and value is seen as a universalization of his own dignity and value. But both rationality and universalization have been severely criticized as foundations of moral value. Hume, Ayer and others, for example, argue that such features are properties of logic, not ethics. So not even Kant seems to be able to explain the intrinsic value of other people. Robert Nozick has an interesting but ambiguous view on the intrinsic view of people. We previously discussed Nozick's idea of intrinsic value being dependent on its degree of organic unity. On this view, he accepts that some objects like art, organic life, and theories have intrinsic value. Yet when he comes to the question of intrinsic value of what he calls selves, he writes that ourselves, limited and finite, are not organically unified enough to be identical with value, though they can only instantiate or have value, unquote. We need not accept Nozick's organic unity as a criterion of intrinsic value, but we can agree with him that a self wants to be valuable, that he also defines as a value-seeking I. Yet we can go on to say that wanting to be valuable is either a possible or a necessary feature of consciousness. And on this view, we can agree that consciousness is a candidate for sometimes having intrinsic value. And in my view, intrinsic value is a consequence of value being assigned reflexively by a state or person. And this is why self-esteem, dignity and magnanimity are intrinsically valuable states. On this account, Nozick appears to resolve the problem of why we should value the intrinsic value of others. He does this also by stating that we should treat everything as having the value that it has. But this fails to answer the question of why should we treat everything as having the value that it has. And this failure also reveals objectivist presuppositions evident in this injunction and in his other statements, as well as in his notion of organic unity and its implication of non-conscious intrinsic values. So in my view, Nozick doesn't answer the question of why we should value the intrinsic value of others. Yet his notions of a value-seeking I that wants to be valuable, as I see them, have implications for the value-seeking agent instead of the intrinsic value of the subject. That is, the value-seeking agent looks out onto the world and asks, how can I find, maintain or further my value? I've answered this question many times in my workshops on cognition, ethics, meaning and purpose. Yet in this discussion, we can regard the fact of other people as a primary focus of value in the world, not least because they are the only instances of intrinsic value in the world apart from ourselves, and that on a value theory ethics, valuing them reflects further value onto ourselves. But I want to distinguish this view from the various forms of self-interest held by Stirner, Rand and Nietzsche. Nietzsche's view is that man always acts for the good, that is, what he conceives as good for himself. This extends the concept of good, but the good here remains unduly tied to desires of the self. These views interestingly begin with the self as the only realistic foundation for values or moral value. But no subjective foundations based on the self have found to be satisfactory. And Bernard Williams presents the charge of self-indulgence against theories of ethics based on self-interest. That is, I quote, what the agent cares about is not so much about other people as himself caring about other people. But Williams does make a qualification that not all reflexive moral thought is self-indulgent. Williams gives the example of modelling one's own behaviour on an ideal. This indicates, of course, very different kinds of self-interest. For example, finding meaning in dying for others is different from stealing a child's ice cream. And different kinds and degrees of reflexivity or self-interest produce different moral assessments. For example, in egoism, selfishness, self-pity, pride, honour, self-worth, dignity, self-esteem, self-respect and self-love. These various examples indicate that a viable ethics based on self-interest might well be constructed. The idea is that all motives are self-interested, but can have different kinds of self-interest. For example, contrast Ayn Rand's ethical egoism to Foucault's care of the self or sufficiency of value. But even given this basis, we are returned to two basic questions. One, why should I accept that other people have intrinsic value? And two, why should I adopt the intrinsic value of others into my own value system? For example, sadists accept the intrinsic value of others, but don't adopt it into their own value system. In fact, sadists accept the intrinsic value of others in order to enhance their heinous satisfactions. On the first question, there are numerous arguments for accepting that other people have intrinsic value. One, the most basic, is by reason, experience and empirical judgment. Two, I know that I have intrinsic value and it's exceedingly probable that others also have intrinsic value. And three, also as conscious beings, people are primary candidates for having intrinsic value. These are straightforward ways of assessing value, but they are contingent claims based on human reason and judgment that don't claim necessary relations. Yet this is an important aspect of my argument about relations of value, also in the realm of ethics. That is, principles of value exist, but that they are variable and graduated and cannot be subjected to strict logical necessity. That is, their material contents are subject to the variabilities of belief, judgment and even reason. Yet it's a strength of such a view that it's not necessary or absolute, but fallibilist, like Popper's science. A fallibilist ethics can account for theoretical and human error and does not need to make absolute claims. Both Kant and John Stuart Mill, for example, claimed necessary relations which could not be justified. We can ask the second, more crucial question of why adopt the intrinsic value of others as my value? We can consider several arguments to consider this difficult and crucial question. But there are other questions following the notion of graduation above that must qualify any answer, such as to what extent should I value the value of others? And this question demonstrates both the variability and the graduation of any possible answer. That is, why should I value others equally as myself, or more or less than myself? These variable and graduated factors are further arguments against absolute or necessary relations with others. But I want to present what I describe as inescapable, not necessary reasons for valuing others. By inescapable, I mean eventually, not immediately, or not necessarily before the end of life. The version of this inescapability that I advocate accepts developing notions of self and refinements of self-value. This view is moving towards the kind of value theory of ethics that I have developed elsewhere. We could also describe such a refined concept of self-value as enlightened self-interest. But how could self-value as enlightened self-interest include the value of other people? It can include the value of others because of the reflexive character of moral action. That is, moral action induces the self-attribution of value. That is, favourable judgments and outcomes accrue self-value. Unfavourable judgments negate self-value. One example is that harming others reflects badly on self-value and vice versa. Conversely, it might be argued that the sadist increases and refines his value by harming others. But harming others gratuitously will eventually be recognized as a pathological weakness, and pathological weakness will eventually undermine refined self-value. But note that there are two presuppositions of this view that we have not yet definitively established. One, the intrinsic value of others that we might accept intuitively or empirically as above, and two, the principle of self-value that is presupposed by this argument. I've argued for a principle of self-value as a will to value previously, and I don't have time to do so here. Yet I can say that not to value value is contradictory, self-negating, and defeats human satisfaction, and that the value of value is evident in every action pursuing self-esteem, meaning, and purpose. As a more practical explanation, self-value is evident in ethics because people can't easily dissociate themselves from their actions. That is, the need to find meaning in one's own behaviour makes it difficult to regard it as of no consequence. A belief in free will also makes people feel responsible for and identify with their actions. People thereby judge themselves as good and valuable or not by their actions. A supplementary argument is that deep knowledge of others requires empathy, which entails the value of others. This strategy turns the difficult problem of establishing value into an easier problem of knowledge. That is, knowledge requires appreciation of value because knowledge and science are value laden. For example, Frank Jackson tells a story about Mary, a scientist who knows everything about colour but is colour blind. So Mary doesn't understand what colour is until she has the experience of colour. The point is that deep knowledge requires phenomenal experience of, in this case, aesthetic value, and deep knowledge of other people requires phenomenal experience and empathy. On this view, the argument with respect to valuing other people is that deep knowledge of others entails empathy and appreciation of their own self-value. Therefore, deep knowledge entails empathy and valuing the self-value of others. That is, like the concept of pain, is only by valuing and experiencing the value can we know it. But this claim is contentious. Does knowledge or even empathy really entail valuing the self-value of others? Like our sadist earlier, we may know or empathize with others but not value them. But this conclusion may depend upon our personal judgments about why we value others. A similarly subjective argument is that human relations aren't a matter of Kantian necessity, but of Aristotelian disposition or expression. That is, a self-valuing agent asks how can he express his values in the world rather than acquire value. He would seek to express positive value by respecting others and avoiding harming them. But one problem here is, how can a value-seeking agent acquire the values that he should express? Aristotle's answer was practice the virtues in order to internalize them. Aristotle's answer, updated, is practice right values in order to internalize and express them. But how can we discern right or correct values as valuing others in the first place? I previously discussed the very contentious issue of correct values by advocating criteria of value. These were criteria like consistency, coherence, non-contradiction, self-validation and sufficiency. Yet two crucial criteria were the will to value and the will to truth. On these postulates of a will to value and a will to truth, we must then ask, what is the best thing that we can do? One inescapable answer is attribute value to other intrinsically valuable and self-valuing beings. This is motivated by a will to value and guided by pragmatic and contingent judgments. Again, this strategy avoids necessary relations that cannot be established. Yet on the principle of a will to value, we go back to the same kind of reasons for action as Singer and Nozick. But they are now the best expressions that we can find of a will to value, not definitive principles. Nozick usefully defined people as value-seeking eyes, but the properties of self-value and seeking value are significantly endorsed by Nozick. But he doesn't develop this property of seeking value as a primary human drive. He is instead concerned with finding properties that we can or should value rather than the agent's motivations. This is because he espouses an ethics of objective criteria rather than a subjectivist ethics of the agent. At this point, I want to return to questions of method that we began with. That is, we come to value other people through our conceptions of them and because of our beliefs about them. The idea of mystical or quantum relations between people is highly contentious, and if there were such, they would be subject to appraisal and judgment. This view draws upon both a phenomenology of our perceptions of others and the cognitive processes involved. In this way, other people can be presented in terms of certain conceptions or cognitive frameworks. This doesn't diminish the significance of the value of others, but accounts for how we apprehend them. Moreover, this approach renders previously incommensurable objects accessible on a scale of value. That is, the abstract principle of truth and the conscious existence of other people are different kinds of things, but both of these make inescapable demands on us, but can be related as conceptions of values. That is, both truth and other people can be understood as different modes of cognition. One aspect of this view involves Barry Maguire's and Derek Parfit's cognitive but value-based theory of reasons. That is, a value-based theory of reasons for actions draws on values, facts and actions required for certain goals, and those values, facts and actions and goals make them relevantly good or worth achieving. But on a desire-based theory of action, a reason for motivation is produced by the satisfaction of a desire. That is, if an action promotes the satisfaction of a desire, we have reason to perform that action. But we have to ask, what is the underlying value or values of a value-based theory of reasons? In the examples above, we have the values of other people and the value of truth or the will to truth. In conclusion, we first outlined a number of ways in which other people are mistakenly valued. These included spiritual, cosmological and quantum relations. Another error was thinking that intrinsic value compels us to value it, and we looked at a number of theories in which offered inadequate explanations. These included the views of Stirner, Rand, Aristotle, Mill and Singer. Even Kant and Nozick weren't able to offer satisfactory explanations. My solution is to make respect for the intrinsic value of others a function of our own self-value. This simplifies supposed relations between people into one of believing that others have intrinsic value, and this view supported by a phenomenological and cognitive but value-based theory of reasons. On this view, reasons for valuing other people are inescapable rather than necessary. This is because of the inevitable nature of values satisfactions, but that they are conditional on the agent's capacities such as awareness of the other's value, will to truth, knowledge, empathy and self-value. These arguments accommodate three crucial aspects of morality. One, they provide a moral imperative founded on value. Two, they account for the finite capacities of reason, choice and knowledge. And three, they provide a moral imperative that is inescapable without invoking necessity. Together with my other arguments, I believe that the above offers an adequate moral theory of other people. My basic point is that pursuit of value requires us to value other people. Next week we will discuss self-value as an antidote to injustice and other perceived frustrations. So let me have your criticism and comments at the meeting or on one of the websites like Zoom or meetup.com.